Hi, my name is Michael Ford. I'm a Character Technology Supervisor at Sony ImageWorks. My role at ImageWorks is to create and develop the characters for the character pipeline. We build these characters for the animators to allow them to create the digital performances, the great performances that you see on screens. Essentially what we do here at ImageWorks is we are obviously a very character-centric studio. We build a lot of characters, visual effects, animation, CG feature type films. Anything from Spider-Man to Superman to our friends behind me, the Boog and Elliot, for Open Season. And Open Season is our first animated feature that's coming out this year. We're real excited about it. And it's just an example of some of the great work that we do here. Well, animators like to request, everything. So essentially, if you can think of it, or they can think of it, we have to put it in there. Now, what we often have to do is find the common ground with them and say, well, if you want everything, it's going to slow it down. If we give you this, it's going to really slow it down. So what they like is they like speed, but they also like the ability to kind of do everything. So we have to find that middle ground. And that's probably one of the most difficult aspects of our job. And I always tend to lean more towards giving them kind of a less flexibility but more speed. I think the more efficient they are, the ability that they have to scrub the timeline, and basically the faster the performance they can get out of it, the better their performance is going to be. I think the first thing you have to look at is what is the character going to need to do? What is the character how is it going to perform? And a lot of that comes from the animators, a lot of it comes from the directors, a lot of it actually just comes from looking at the character itself. I mean, if you take, for example, Boog, he's a 900-pound grizzly bear, but he's expected to do things that normal 900-pound grizzly bears do not do. I mean, he's jumping, he's basically acting. He rides a tricycle. So 900-pound grizzly bears don't normally do that, so we have to take that into account. We also have to just take into account that this is a very cartoony film. It's a very squash and stretch based film. So everything that we do is basically coming down to, okay, what does this character have to do? And in most cases, they have to do everything, but we try to make tough decisions, tough choices on what we can take out, what we put in. Boog and Elliot's rigs were a little different in that one's obviously a deer who actually walks on 2 legs, so that's a little different. But in some parts of the films, he walks on 4 legs, which makes a unique challenge. They're different. Boog is more of actually what we would refer to as a biped. It's a human rig with a lot of padding around it, essentially. Elliot was a little bit more of a challenge because we knew that in most of the film, he wasn't going to be very anatomical. He was actually going to perform more like a biped, more like a human. But in some cases, he was going to have to drop down onto all 4s and walk like a deer. Now, deer front legs and human arms do not work the same. They actually bend differently. So we had to figure out a way of actually inversing the arms as they drop to the ground, which is one of the bigger challenges we had to deal with. The biggest difference for these characters was that the directors had mandated us to give the animators the ability to change the outline, the shape of basically every part of the character. So what they had asked us to do is take a more traditional approach in that if you're going to create a line from, say, the foot all the way up to the head or to the end of the tip of the finger, they wanted that line to be smooth. And in most cases, 3D is not smooth. You're actually building a kind of a lumpy model that has all of its muscles and all of the shapes that are already predefined. So what we had to do is we had to basically create a system that we called shapers, which is we took almost every segment of the character and allowed the animator to deform it into exactly what they wanted to. Like every line, every shape, everything is defined for that frame to camera. And so the animators they would animate, and then they would actually go through and do what they called sort of a shaper pass or a line pass, where they would take out the lumpiness, the kind of bumps and the things that they didn't like. And so for every frame in the film, there's some shaper work that's been done to basically create really nice arcs, really smooth transitions from, say, the foot all the way up to the tip of the finger. The animators kind of spent more time getting into the character instead of the voice. I mean, the voice sort of it was such a good voice that they didn't really, it wasn't about Martin Lawrence and it wasn't about Ashton Kutcher. It was more about the character Boog and the character Elliot. So it was more important to actually stick with the character. And because the performances are so good, they didn't need to really look at the performance on the videotape. So the way that we approach building characters here at ImageWorks is that we work with visual development department, and the visual development department basically takes the concepts, the original designs from the director, and they work with other artists, character designers who are assigned to the film. And a lot of time is just spent working in 2D. A lot of time is just breaking down exactly what they want the character to look like, from really rough sketches into more and more detail, more and more detail. We've built maquettes, which are the sculptures that a lot of studios build to really get a sense of what the character looks like in 3D. We also go ahead and build 3D models that aren't ever going to be used actually in the film. They're not going to be used what we rig. They're actually just design concepts. And that whole process, what it eventually does is basically saves us time in the end, because we're not going to be going back to the model and going back to the model every single time something needs to change. We really honed in on the design, seeing what it looks like in 3D, so that we can essentially nail it the first time when we're actually going to go through the process of lighting it, and rendering it, and rigging it, and then eventually animating it. I think what was really unique about this project was we had a great character designer named Carter Goodrich, who is really good at getting the essence of a character. He's really good at really loose drawings. The problem with that, however, is loose drawings don't exactly translate really well into 3D. So there was a lot of interpretation that had to go on with the character designer Carter and the modeler Henry Darnell and the directors. So there was a lot of work that was done at the modeler's desk. We basically just had to sit down and say, okay, here's the essence of what you drew, Carter. Here's what we're interpreting. What do you think? How do we work together to make this better? And it was a really collaborative process that I think ultimately became very successful, because Boog and Elliot and the rest of the characters they were based on really strong character designs, and they were, executed in 3D really well. So for the modeler, in the case of Boog, he knows that the character is going to be furred. So there's a lot of choices that he has to make and a lot of interpretations that he has to make about the design. He doesn't know the end result. We haven't even furred it yet. It's a different process. So the modeler is sort of building something that eventually will become a lot larger and a lot more volume. So what we actually do is we build what we call a fur volume or a boundary volume. And that represents to the directors, represents to the artists around them, basically, this is how big we think the character's going to get. So it's a tough challenge for the modeler, because they're making a leap of faith. They're saying that, okay, he's going to look really skinny for a while to the rest of you, but I know he's going to get this big. So for the fur volume, what Henry Darnell actually ended up doing is he created these two models. He created one that was the skinny Boog and one that was the fat Boog. And fat Boog, we sort of went back and forth trying to define how big that space would be, how much fur would be on that character. A lot of it was done just basically taking some orthographic drawings that we had from the VizDev department, the visual development department, and building that model, because the VizDev department had delivered us a rendering of the fur and what it was supposed to look like. And so Henry built the boundary volume to that size. And we have to carry that into rigging, we have to carry that into animation as well, because they need to know how big the character is when they're animating it. It's actually a tough challenge in that you need to know that Boog's arm's going to be sitting down, say on the side of the truck, so you need to know how big his arm is. So we have to carry that all the way through rigging, all the way into animation. We did a lot of experimentation on how we were going to rig the fat and the jiggle and all of the dynamics that went into Boog. And we actually had a lot of options. Because we had the shapers that were built into the character, we actually had a ton of options. The animator could do it in his shot. We also had the advantage of going to, because we're such a big facility, we have the option of going to our dynamics department, our cloth and hair department, and they also just plussed it. They basically, anytime an animator would put a character into a position and it needed to follow through, they would actually add in that dynamic animation just to make it just to look a little bit more real. They also had dynamic hair that if any shot that needed it, whether there was wind or whether there was any sort of effect that needed to be added to the hair, they would add that in on top of what the animator had already done, and it just looks fantastic. So some of the advice that I'd give you in creating really nice models and really nice rigs is just be prepared. I think going into any sort of character, you have to know what that character is going to do, and you have to know what that character is going to look like. So it's worth spending the time making that extra drawing, making that extra conversation with the animators you're going to be working with and saying, hey, what are you expecting? What are you going to be expecting this character is going to do? Because the farther you get into a project, the more expensive, the more time, and I don't care whether you're a student or you're running, a multi-million-dollar facility, the more time you spend on something, the harder it is for you to make that decision later. It's better to make a lot of tough choices early and say, you know what, we don't need to do it this way, or we do need to do it this way. So it's just making really good decisions ahead of time, and having that extra conversation can really help. I think what has separated me and a lot of other artists is the fact that we always can fall back on our artistic talents. Technical ability can be taught, and I think that, from my standpoint, what I've always leaned towards is my ability to figure out what something should look like, because it's a much harder skill, I think, to develop. And I was a design major at UCLA. I have a background in drawing. I'd always drawn all my life, and so I'm more of an artist than a technician, and I'm sort of caught between these two worlds, and I think a lot of people are caught between the artistic side and the technical side, and a lot of focus is more on training the technical side and learning a program. But what you really don't want to forget is you don't want to forget that you are an artist and you need to achieve a certain look for something. And that's something that you shouldn't lose focus on, that you should stay the course on being an artist. Learn as much as you can technically, because it can really help you get out of a tough situation. But in the end, you need to know what that arm needs to look like, what a 900-pound grizzly bear, if he's squashy and stretchy, should look like. And that can come from you, and that's what's so great about it. I think one of the classic stories I'd like to remake is put Paul Bunyan in a modern world and see how he deals with all this new technology and all these things and he's just got his axe. I'd like to see something like that. He was a giant. He's a big guy. And a big blue ox.
Yeah, he had the ox.
Yes. I don't know whether the ox would make the cut, but I think my favorite comic book character's got to be Batman. And the reason why is because of Frank Miller's graphic novel, Dark Knight Returns. And it came out when I was a kid, and I was just like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. So that sort of inspired me. That comic book was another thing that sort of inspired me to stay artistic, because I thought it was so, not only well written, but it was just well designed. It just had a really nice feel to it, and they finally made a Batman movie that works. This last one. So, well, I always liked Daffy Duck. I always liked the whatever the one where he basically takes his bill and he pulls it around his head. That's what I always liked about those characters. They could do anything. You could put them in any situation, and they could fit right in. That was the beauty of those characters. I have a slight plug here, but I did write my own book called Inspired 3D Character Setup. It's a whole series, actually. So I often plug that. But there's other great books as well. There's Gary Fagan's Facial Expression, which is a really good book on sort of breaking down the poses that people go through when they're angry, when they're sad, and it goes down actually to the muscular level, seeing what actually happens in the face. That's a really good book for exploring what you need to do when you're going to be building a facial rig. There's Anatomy for the Artist, which is, I think it's by Peck. It's another great book, which just has really great drawings, really great images of anatomy, which is something that we all need to focus on, whether it's human or whether it's a deer or whatever it is. We need to know how things originally moved so that we can interpret them into 3D. I think what we're going to be doing is we're going to be borrowing a lot of things from the real-time applications, more of like the game engines, so that animators and that artists can see things and work with them more interactively. Lighting interactively, rendering things interactively. So if you wanted to see what, a lot of things that we deal with is, we can't render the hair like that. We can't see it right away. So I think it's working on tools that allow artists to make quicker decisions, that allow them to say that, okay, if I make this choice, if I'm an animator, if I put it in this pose, what is it going to eventually look like? What am I going to see when it gets lit, rendered, and composited? It's a better interpretation to make better choices, and that's really going to speed up filmmaking. It's going to speed up the process of creating not only the characters, but the animation and the lighting and everything. And I think we're going to be approaching that in that 5 to 10 year range, where things are just going to be almost real time and we're going to be able to see them.